Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has recently called on the EU to mobilise frozen Russian assets to aid the efforts in Ukraine. The proposal comes as tensions continue to simmer between the US, Russia, Ukraine and the EU over issues such as defence, ceasefire talks and tariffs. My name is Angela Scoogens. This is TVP World and I'm joined here in our Brussels studio with Bart Szewczyk. He's a senior fellow from the German Marshall Fund think tank here. He is here to explain this audacious proposal and these simmering transatlantic tensions in more detail. Hi Bart.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you on. What was your reaction when the news broke recently from the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk to mobilise these funds? Is this precedented?
Well, I think it's a great idea and it's actually been discussed behind the scenes and periodically by various European leaders. Look, there are about 200 billion euro worth of immobilized Russian state assets sitting here in Brussels, in fact, at Euroclear. And the EU has full legal grounds to seize these assets to provide for reconstruction of Ukraine, to provide for weapons supplies to Ukraine, and for other measures. And this is something that the EU could do on its own. It can do so on Monday, it can do so today, has full authority, and is just a matter of political will. And I'm glad that the Prime Minister has been vocal on this, because obviously there's a lot of sense of urgency right now to come up with new ideas to show Europe's role in this, in supporting Ukraine. And this is, again, something that is fully within Europe's discretion, fully within its so-called strategic autonomy, as President Macron likes to frequently remind people. And so I hope that now Paris and Berlin and other European capitals will mobilize around Prime Minister Tusk's idea.
If it is legal, why hasn't it been done before?
Well, look, not everything that's legal you necessarily do at the outset. And so I think people have digested, the legal analysis over the past 2 years and concluded that there are legal grounds to seize these assets. I think in some capitals there were concerns over having too forceful of a Russia policy and maybe playing for time, seeing how things play out. But now I think we're at a stage where both the European taxpayers have borne a lot of the burden of support to Ukraine, something on the order of 260 billion euro that's been provided or pledged over the past 2.5 years. Ukraine obviously has borne the brunt of the damage and the costs over the past 3 years. And there's no reason why Russia shouldn't be required to pay, and to pay now. And I think we're also in a situation where at some point people thought, well, we will hold these assets as leverage in potential peace negotiations, and then we will only return these assets if Russia pays reparations and comes to the peace negotiating table. And that argument never held water, and it holds even less water now, because there is a risk that unless bold action is delivered by Europe, you could be faced in a situation where 2 years from now, Kremlin is running Ukraine and Kremlin is paying itself reparations and then getting these seized assets back from Europe. So I think the time for deliberation and the discussions is behind us. And as Prime Minister Tusk has pointed out, this is something, again, that Europe could do on Monday. It's a matter of drafting and issuing the decision, requesting the Belgian government to issue its decision, and then Euroclear hands over the seized assets to the Ukraine facility or some other fund dedicated to Ukraine.
And the timing of this, did Donald Tusk call for it now because of the ceasefire talks and Europe ostensibly being left out of those talks? Do you think that's the reason why he did it now?
Well, look, I can't speak for Prime Minister Tusk, obviously, but this is something that's been in reserve. This is a card that Europe has been able to play over the past 2 years. And it is something that, again, is fully within its discretion, within its autonomy. And it's a way to generate quite significant resources in support of Ukraine. 200 billion is not an insignificant amount. Just to give you a couple of examples, it's equal to about we've provided as the West about 100 billion more so of military aid over the past 3 years. So this is double of that, right? And for the U.S. weapon supplies that have flown to Ukraine, that's about 60 billion. So 200 billion could purchase, anywhere from 6 to 7 years of those continued weapon supplies from the United States to Ukraine. So this is a sizable amount of money. And again, it's something that's urgently needed to show and to give, a little bit of confidence and some new ideas to help the situation in Ukraine. It's also the case that it's not only helping Ukraine, but it's also putting additional pressure on Russia. It's not necessarily apples to apples, but Russia spends about something on the order of around 300 billion euro on its defense budget a year. So this is almost a year's worth of what Russia spends on its war effort. So, this is real money, and it's both real support for Ukraine and real pressure on Russia.
So it's not peanuts, is what you're saying?
No, it's a big decision. And it's something, again, there are lots of, it's a time of a lot of uncertainty, and people are trying to figure out what can we do, what can be done practically in this new situation. And, whereas it might be difficult to reconstruct everything, let's say, you're not going to be able to stand up an effective big army from one day to the next. You're not going to be able to develop nuclear weapons one day to the next if you need a nuclear security umbrella. But this is something that can be done on Monday, or Tuesday, any day of the week. It can be done. It's been hashed through numerous times. There are extensive legal analyses and legal bases to substantiate this political decision. And it's, a decision from the Council of the EU to the Belgian government, to Euroclear, and then to a Ukrainian fund.
Question for you, though. The European Commission said today that member states are discussing a proposal like this, as well as international players such as the US. If we're hearing rhetoric from US President Donald Trump that he wants to hammer out these ceasefire negotiations with Putin, why would the US be advocating for a move like this?
Well, look, because it's a matter of carrots and sticks. On the one hand, President Trump has expressed interest in launching peace negotiations, which was done last week before the Munich Security Conference. And you had the initial meetings in Riyadh between Secretary Rubio and Minister Lavrov. But, Secretary Rubio was quite cool-headed about the prospects for these negotiations. He said recently that these are talks about talks. There's no real process. There's no clear endpoint. It's unclear where any of this will go, which is, natural in these types of very complex negotiations. Even when they're launched, you don't necessarily know how long they're going to take, where they will end up. And it's possible that, we'll be in a situation not too different from where we are right now, but at least we'll have made a good faith effort. And so at the same time that the United States government and President Trump is launching these negotiations, they also want to ensure that they have as strong a hand as possible. And this measure, seizing these assets and seizing them now, would be one way to do it, because not only do you all of a sudden have a huge pool of resources on the order, in Europe it's about 200 billion, globally it's about 300 billion. So, even more money than we were talking about before. And so you strengthen Ukraine's hand, you put additional pressure on Russia, and this is how you maximize your chance of success in these types of negotiations. Now, let's see, where all of this will go. It's a very fluid situation, but I think that type of approach would make sense.
And it's interesting because what we've been hearing from EU member states is that they want to put Ukraine in a position of strength to go to these ceasefire negotiations. So I understand that this could be one way of getting there. But you mentioned US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We know, media reports is suggesting that Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski was recently in Washington. Media reports suggest that he had a meeting with that Washington official. Why do you think Sikorski was allegedly invited to the US to have these meetings? And what do you think they spoke about, these leaders?
Right. So, look, Minister Sikorski has been a key player on all these discussions over the past couple of decades. He's a very well-known actor and leader in the United States, as well as in Europe. At the Munich Security Conference, he met with Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia policy, Keith Kellogg, and as I understand, had good discussions with him. And it's important for him to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and people in Congress, senators, congressmen, and also the wider American community, as well as I understand he might give a speech at the UN on these issues up in New York. And, you know, it'll be very important for him to be able to speak on behalf of not only of Poland, but also on behalf of Europe, because he is a trusted voice in Europe. And now Poland holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the EU. He's been seconded by HRVP Kaja Kallas to speak on behalf of Europe on a number of issues, especially within the UN. And so, you know, he, I think, will, and again, I can't speak for him or Prime Minister Tusk, but I imagine he would want to deliver a message of resolve on the part of Europe, some new ideas of what Europe can bring to the table, such as seizing Russian state assets, potentially, you know, finding European financing for U.S. weapon supplies to Ukraine. There is this idea also of peacekeeping troops and, you know, lots of different variations around that topic. And I think everything will be on the table. And the nice thing about Minister Sikorski is that he will cut through to the heart of the problem and offer some clear solutions. Now, it takes two to tango, and so it will ultimately depend on what the U.S. administration wants to do on Ukraine and Russia policy. And as I understand, the situation is somewhat fluid right now, and we'll see where it goes.
We know that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has also been calling for a European envoy to sit at the negotiation tables for these ceasefire talks.
Right.
I think he said that he wanted a head of state or someone on that level. Could the foreign minister from Poland, his visit to Washington, be a way for Poland to angle themselves to be that European envoy?
Look, it's obviously for Ukrainian President Zelensky and the U.S. administration and other counterparts to figure out exactly who is at the table, whether it's Poland's prime minister or foreign minister or anyone else. I think it is important to have, you know, the most important thing is to have a coordinated effort on the part of the West, on the part of the EU, the US, the UK, Canada, Norway, the wider NATO alliance, plus Japan, Korea. You know, we've been effective as much as we could have been over the past 3 years because the West has acted in unison. And, you know, various people can speak on behalf of the West. It was President Biden, President von der Leyen, you know, various people at various times. So I don't think the key issue is who is exactly at which table at any given point in time. You know, at a certain point, it does make sense to have a streamlined process where, you know, the key individuals are at the table. But what is important is to have a sense of what is the overall direction that we are heading into. And I sincerely hope that the direction that we're heading into is one where Ukraine is strengthened in these ceasefire negotiations. And ultimately, the idea that Europe and America and everyone else has is that Ukraine must prevail. And that whatever ceasefire outcome is and whatever, you know, other results of the negotiations are, that it benefits Ukraine, that we do not see in Ukraine what we saw elsewhere, where basically the aggressor can run the show. And I think right now, because things are a little bit fluid, what would have been unthinkable maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, that Kremlin could run Ukraine, unfortunately is not a non-zero probability event. And I think everything has to be done to make sure that that doesn't happen. And for Europe and America and others to come together and have a sensible, reasonable approach on this issue.
Of course, and we're talking about Ukraine being placed in a position of strength. Do you think the visit of US Special Envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, his visit to Ukraine, did that put Ukraine in a position of strength? Did that bear any fruit for Ukraine?
I think so. Keith Kellogg came out with sort of a peace plan proposal about a year ago when he was still in his private citizen capacity on the Trump campaign. And, the overall approach, which was we should try to find an end to the violence and to the conflict any way we can. And we want to make sure that both Russia and Ukraine come to the negotiating table, and we, put pressure on Russia, we strengthen Ukraine's hand, and we see where that effort results in. That's a sensible proposal, and that's what he was bringing in the administration, and that's the line of policy that I understand he's pursuing. And so, it was an important visit that he had in Ukraine. There are ongoing discussions on a number of issues between him on behalf of the administration and Ukraine. And then there are also, other approaches and other players involved on this set of issues. And so ultimately, what I hope results from this flurry of activity, because it's been a dizzying week, if not, a little bit longer. And what I hope results from all of this flurry of activity is and perhaps a renegotiated basis for Western cooperation. Maybe Europe writ large picks up more of the financial tab for supporting Ukraine. FYI, Europe is already contributing something like 2/3 of the overall package to Ukraine between military, financial, and other assistance, not to mention all the aid for refugee protection that Europe has spent within its borders. But, it is true that Ukraine's existence, survival, defense, and freedom is existential for Europe in a way that may be not as strongly felt in the United States right now. And so it's possible that Europe at large could pick up an additional cost burden of, 100, 200, whatever billion euro. But ultimately, where I hope this ends up is a general continuation of the policy that Ukraine must be defended, because there's so much at stake on this. It cannot be overstated that if Ukraine falls, it's not going to be like, South Vietnam for the United States or even Afghanistan for the West. This will really hit hard at the way of life in Europe and what we experience as European citizens, as Western citizens on the daily life. And not to be too dramatic, but, if Ukraine falls, all of a sudden, NATO probably implodes. Countries are trying to figure out how to survive in this new regime. You're going to have Russian operatives throughout Europe causing mayhem. And that's not a world that I don't think anyone wants to live in. And so I think everyone's trying to now figure out a different course of action to avert that.
Absolutely, and as you said, it's been a dizzying couple of weeks, so we'll wait and see what comes out of those ceasefire talks and actions from Brussels.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Bart.
All right.
And thank you so much for watching. My name is Angela Scoogens. This is TVP World, but make sure you stick around because there's more news, analysis and commentary coming up. See you next time.